Hi everyone, welcome to Clarity 16.3.0 Supportability Training. This is Denise Saladay. Reporting, I'll be covering the topic data providers. This release for reporting, we have a new workspace in Modern. And inside of that workspace, we have a new tile for data providers. And that is where we have object-based data that we use in reporting that is against the data warehouse. We also are delivering 22 out-of-the-box data providers, which customers can use as a sample to create their own data providers for their report development activities. The reporting workspace, including the data providers feature, is in alpha with release 16.3.0. Of course, we're very interested in your feedback as you begin to use these capabilities. Before I demo data providers, I wanted to give you some context of where they fit in to our reporting infrastructure. So today we have the Clarity Transactional Database, which is this blue box. And also today we have the Load Data Warehouse job and the Load Data Warehouse Access Rights job that take the data from the Clarity schema and they populate it into the data warehouse. What we're doing this release is we're providing a new capability to populate into the data warehouse SQL curve data. And this SQL curve data is what we're going to use in the data provider to display per period metrics. So if you don't have this enabled, you won't be able to see per period metrics in the data provider. Now over here on the right, in the red box, is data providers. It's new for this release and they're the building blocks for reporting. And they provide object-based data from the data warehouse. Soon we will have Report Designer, but in Report Designer is where report developers will build reports and they'll use data providers to do that. Next, I'll demonstrate in the product how users can create, edit, view, publish, copy, inactivate, and delete data providers. After that, we'll take a look at how to test and troubleshoot these data providers. And lastly, we'll view our 22 out-of-the-box data providers. The data provider has a dependency on a new capability that we're delivering in the data warehouse, and you can refer to more details of this capability in the data warehouse supportability training. Under classic administration, under data warehouse options, there's a new setting here for the data warehouse called include SQL curve data, and notice that it is in beta. By default, this setting is not checked. In order to see per period metrics in the data providers, you need to have this checked. As part of this release, there's a new workspace called Reporting. It contains one tile called Data Providers. Access to the reporting workspace is granted through a global security right called Reporting Navigate. This workspace does have a toggle called Reporting Data Providers, which includes the workspace as well as the data providers tile. And you can see here that it's enabled by default, but customers can toggle it off. Access to the data providers tile is also granted through global security rights. If you have the reporting data providers navigate right, you'll be able to see the tile. And the other operations will enable you to copy, create, delete, edit, and view data providers. Note that the data provider's object is hidden in Classic Studio and also in Modern in the Attributes module under Administration. OBS security is also supported on the data provider's object. You can see here that I associated data providers to the organizational OBS. Administrators will also have the following new instance security rights to secure data providers. Delete, edit, and view is available. Notice here in the data provider grid that my OBS organizational is appearing here in my grid. And I secured my investment KPIs data provider for only those resources under digital banking. Because we are hiding the data provider object in Classic Studio, we're automatically assigning the API attribute ID for any OBSs that are associated to data providers. So those OBS attributes will automatically be available in Modern. The status of a data provider is automatically set by where it's at in the workflow, and we're going to review that workflow next. Here is a diagram of the data provider workflow. I've separated it into two separate workflows, one for unpublished and one for published. And the mode that you're in for each is designated by the red boxes. So when you create a data provider for the first time, you're in draft mode. And the status in draft mode is draft. You could exit your data provider without publishing it and continue to make changes throughout time, and it will retain its status of draft. But whenever your data provider is complete, you would click Publish. And at that time, your data provider status will be changed to Published. Published data providers have two different modes that you can be in. One is View mode and the other is Edit mode. And if you don't make any changes to your published data provider after it's been published, the status will stay as published. Now you can edit a published data provider, and as soon as you do that, then its status will be changed to published with a Has Edits tag. And this is demonstrated by the workflow on the right. And while you make additional changes to your published data provider, if you exit, it will autosave those edits that you made. So it will have the Has Edits tag. But if you decide to discard the edits that you're making, then of course it'll discard those edits and it won't have the Has Edits tag. It'll just be status of published. As you continue to make edits to a published data provider with the Has Edits tag, once those edits are done, you can always publish your data provider, at which time your status will then go to just published. The data provider grid can be accessed through the data provider's tile, and it supports all of our normal common component grid capabilities, such as the saved views, filters, conditional formatting, search, and also the bulk edit and copy operations. Additionally, the starred attribute is available, and you have both the details flyout and the column panel. And you can export this to CSV. So the two things that are not available are the Quick Add Plus is not available here, And one thing I wanted to point out too is the search bar here works on the name, this column here. So to create a new data provider, just click on the New Data Provider button. And you enter your name, which is required. Description is optional. And click Create. It's important to note that once you enter your name, which is required, your Objects tab becomes active, but the remaining tabs, Joins, Pre-filter, Security, and Preview, will remain inactive. By default, data providers are active and they're in draft mode, and the ID attribute on this object has auto numbering set up. Next, we'll navigate to the Objects tab. Here is where we will define which objects and attributes are available to users as they build reports in the future. In order to have a valid data provider, you need to select at least one attribute from one or more objects. The search bar will search across both objects and attributes. If the object name matches the search criteria, it will return all of those attributes underneath that object, as you can see here by this investment that I have selected. Best practices are that you do not select the entire object to bring into the data provider, which would be just selecting here this object. Notice it selected all attributes here, and now I have all attributes. What you want to do instead is only select those attributes that you need in your data provider. Because remember, all the attributes that are in the selected box are what users are going to see. So once you select all the relevant attributes with a checkbox, you'll just hit the right caret here to move them over. And these are the attributes that I've selected on my investment object. Note that once you have at least one attribute selected, that the remaining tabs for your data provider are now active. Also note that once I have at least one attribute selected, I now have the Publish button, which is now active. Because this is a KPIs data provider, I'm also going to select some attributes from my status report. Note that next to each search box here that there's an Expand All, Collapse All icon in both the available and the selected box. And naturally, as you would expect, you can click this to expand everything in your window or collapse it all. The objects in the available box show alphabetically, and the attributes in each object also show alphabetically. But in the selected box, the objects will display in the order that you select them in, and the attributes underneath them will appear alphabetically. You want to make sure that the primary object that you're using to base this data provider on is listed first. And whenever users go to use this data provider, it's the first object that they'll see available for selecting attributes into their reporting content. And this is the order that users will see whenever they're browsing the data provider. If you want to change the order of any of these objects, if you hover over the object, there's some drag handles here that you can move your items. We do not support field level security yet in the data providers. Next, we'll move over to our Joins tab, which is where we define the relationships between our objects that are selected. By default, you will notice that we automatically created auto joins for the two objects that I selected here, both the investment and the status report. auto joins will be created in your data provider for child subobjects that are defined in Classic Studio. You can see here that the status report object is a child object to the investment master object in Classic. If you have only one object in your data provider, it's not required for you to enter joins. But if you have two or more objects, it's required that you join all of your objects together. This join box here defines the relationship between two objects. You'll define the type of join. The default here for auto joins is inner joins. And you'll define the join. Equals is our default. And the objects that you have selected in your data provider will appear here in the order that they show up in your selected box. In this case, it picked the investment one first and the status report object next. And in here, you have a list of all attributes that are in your data. The attribute list that is available under each object are all of the attributes in the object, not just the ones that you selected for this particular data provider. And essentially they're grouped into two basic categories. One is key attributes, and then underneath that is other attributes. Whenever you're joining objects together, you should try and use the key attributes because these are the attributes that define the relationships between objects. Whenever you select a key attribute from the list here in this grouping, the key attributes grouping, they're identified by this key icon. And the same thing over here for this attribute list over here. And as a reminder, we have this information message here that you should use key attributes when joining objects together. If I had another join condition between these two objects, I could just click on this plus button, which will add another row, and I could define my conditions here. And if I were to exit my data provider with this incomplete join condition without filling out any of these values here, it would automatically delete this incomplete join condition, but I can also delete it here using the trash can. I can also add join condition filters to this condition, and I'm just going to add one here where the status report is only joined for the latest status report. Similar to the attribute pull-down list, any filters that you build on your join condition is available for all attributes in the object, not just the ones that you have selected into your data provider. So you'll remember that I didn't select the latest attribute to display in my data provider. Any changes that I make to this auto join here, including conditions and filters, will be saved. So you can override these auto join conditions. If I had another object that I had added into my data provider, I can always add a new join box and select and define the relationship between those objects. And if I also have the capability to delete an entire join box. So if I wanted to build this from scratch, I could delete even the auto join. And there's also a hover that's available where you can reorder these join boxes. Next, let's navigate to the Pre-Filters tab. Here is where you will add a filter that will apply to the entire result set and not just specific objects. this is an optional tab. And if you want to add another filter, and let's say I only want to show those investments that are active, I could do so here. And remember that this attribute active was not selected into this data provider. So I do have all attributes available in the object that I can use to define any pre-filters that I may want for my data provider. Next, we'll navigate to the Security tab, and it's always optional on whether you want to apply security or not to your data provider. Today, we only have investment and resource master object security available for data providers because that's all that's in the warehouse today. To activate security, I just toggle it on, and because I only have the investment object and not the resource object in my data provider, I will see an option for investment security. If my data provider also included the resource object, I could build security for both, which will ensure that users will have the rights and will be able to only see those resources investments where they have the rights to view. Next, we'll take a look at the Preview tab. This tab is for data provider testing only and does not control user data or presentation in their reporting content. So as such, anything that you enter here is really optional. Note by default that there aren't any columns selected in the grid and that the objects appear in the order that I selected them in the selected box in the Objects tab. The column panel only shows those attributes that were selected into your data provider. The attributes underneath each object will display alphabetically, and if I had any per period metrics that were selected as part of this data provider, they would be grouped at the bottom under a per period section, just like we do in our common grid today. While testing this data provider, I can also create filters, and the attributes that will be available are only those attributes that are selected into my data provider. Next, I added the attributes in my grid that I wanted to test for this data provider. And note that the View Query button became enabled once I selected my first column into the grid, and we're going to go into what this represents in a little bit later. In Preview, I also have view options available where I could format my per period metrics and set word wrap accordingly. The two things that we did not make available on this grid, because it's used for just testing data providers, is the Save Views or the Details flyout. To facilitate testing, we added a property to this tab called Show Data. By default, it's set at partial. This will control the number of records that you see in the grid during your testing. Partial will return 100 rows into your grid, and if you're using Group By, it's going to return 100 rows for each group. When you export to CSV in partial data mode, it will only export that partial data. You can also set this to full mode. This mode will return all of the results from your data provider. And whenever you export to CSV, you'll receive full data. For each data provider, the Show Data setting will persist by user by session. To troubleshoot your data provider, you can just click on this View Query button, which will show the query that the data provider generated. You can also copy the query to the clipboard so that you can run it in any database query tool. And there's not any syntax that we have special here for the data provider. You won't need to make any changes and it will just run in that tool. And you have the scroll available here. You can view the entire query, and when you're done you can just close it. Any filters that you added to your data provider will display in your query. Once you're done testing your data provider, you can publish it. And this publish button here is available on any tab. And to publish it, you just click it. After you publish your data provider, you'll be out of edit mode and you'll be in view mode, which is why you now have the edit button available. And note that on every tab you're going to see this message here, published, and it'll have the date and the time, no matter which tab you're on, that this data provider was published. And if you navigate back to the grid, you can see that it now has a status of published. Next, we'll take a look at editing data providers. There are some things that you can edit directly in the data provider grid without being in the provider in edit mode. You can update the name, the description, and the active flag, and any OBS attributes that you have for your data provider, as well as the starred attributes. Any other attributes for the data provider must be updated while the data provider is in edit mode. Next, let's open up our data provider. You can see we're in view mode here, but we'll open it into edit mode. In this mode, you can update anything on any of these tabs, and you have the exit, discard exits, and publish buttons available. Remember that all unpublished data providers are always in edit mode and they have a draft status. Let's make a change to our data provider, and we'll add the attribute financial status from the investment object. And let's exit edit mode. So I'm back in view mode for this data provider, but notice that it now has a has edits tag. And you'll see that tag regardless of which tab that you're on in the data provider. And whenever you navigate to the data provider grid, you can also see that this data provider, which was published, also has the has edits tag here. If I had published my data provider instead of exiting it, it would just have the publish status and it would have never had the has edits tag. Any data providers that have the has edits tags essentially have two versions of it. I am in view mode now, and you can tell because I have the edit button active. And if we go in here to the objects, you can see under the investment that the field that I brought in for financial status is not here because this is the published version of this data provider. The only way that I can view these edits is to go into edit mode. And you can see now that the financial status attribute that I brought in that caused my has edits tag to show up is now visible. There may be times when one of your existing data providers contains attributes that the Clarity administrator either deactivated or deleted. So regardless of which mode you're in when you enter the data provider, for viewing or editing, or even in draft mode, you will receive a missing data pop-up, which will give you a list of the objects and the attributes that are no longer available for the data provider. And you'll have two options here. You can either click Close to close this window and exit without making any changes to the data provider, and each time that you go in subsequently, you'll receive the same missing data pop-up window. Or what you could do is click the Remove button, and it will automatically remove these attributes from any conditions and filters and from the selected attribute list within your data provider. Next, we're going to take a look at how you could copy data providers. You have the right-click option available here for copy, or you could select the Copy button. And you can type in the new name for your data provider and click Copy. Note that my source data provider was a published data provider that has edits that were unpublished. But my new copy data provider is draft mode, and it does not have a has edits tag. And it does not include any edits that were made from the original data provider. So if we look at our draft data provider objects, note that the financial status attribute from the edits of the source data provider did not get copied over. One other thing I wanted to point out on this copy is we did copy over everything that you had configured on your preview tab, even though it's only used for data provider testing. To delete a data provider, you can either use the right-click action, or you could use the delete button. If you have a data provider that's already used in a report or in the report designer, like this one, notice that the delete button is deactivated and the right-click action is not available. To inactivate a data provider, just under the active column, you just uncheck it. Data providers used in reports can be inactivated, but that doesn't mean that their existing reports will fail. Our intention is that when users are building new reports, they just won't see this data provider and be able to select it as a new data provider into their reporting content. You'll note here that as soon as I inactivated this data provider, that it shows up in italics. And I can perform the same operations on this data provider in an inactive state as I could when it was active. And I can also just reactivate it by clicking on the active. The final topic that I want to cover is our out-of-the-box data providers. We're delivering 22 out-of-the-box data providers that are available to customers for sample use. They are all designated as system and active, and because they're defined as system, users will not be allowed to modify or delete these data providers. For best practice, a customer should make a copy of any of these out-of-the-box data providers and then modify their own copy as needed and inactivated the out-of-the-box data provider by unchecking the active flag. We've provided a good sample in various functional areas. The customer should be able to understand and learn how to build their own data providers. For example, we have a provider for assignments, change requests, financial data, ideas, investments, hierarchies, issues, projects, resources, roles, and teams, risks, roadmap items, which are linked to investments, staff, status reports, tasks, and then we have 3 for time. We have time entries and time sheets, which another one for those as well as the notes that are associated to either of those, and one for just time sheet management. And we have another grouping of them for to-dos on various items here. And this will conclude supportability training for data providers under reporting. Thank you.